Lipshutz. So welcome everybody, and welcome folks online as well as people here in person. My name is Victoria Wolcott. I'm director of the Gender Institute and a professor of history here at UB. Before we get started with today's event, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land upon which the University at Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. Again, thank you all so much for coming today. And before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to highlight one more event that the Gender Institute is doing, which is next Friday here in Buffalo at Fitz Books and Waffles. We're going to be celebrating a new book written by 4 alumna of the University at Buffalo called Spiritualism's Place, Reformers, Seekers, and Seances in Lilydale. So for those of you who are in Buffalo, please join us for that event as well. And also, I want to indicate that this is actually the inaugural lecture of a new series that the Gender Institute has started called Beyond Binaries, Sex, Gender, and the Natural World. I want to especially thank Kelsey Lewis, who's over here in person, for helping us so much with this series, as well as Megan Vaughn and Sarabi Pont for all the work they do at the Gender Institute, and for the Department of Biology and the Center for Conclusive Excellence for their co-sponsorship of this event as well. The Gender Institute has always emphasized the importance of crossing disciplines, and we're sort of a unique program in that we actually cover the entire university, which offers a lot of opportunities for interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary conversations. And it's in that spirit that we created these series of talks. As well as the obvious kind of, interests that humanists who are working on gender and sexuality have with biologists who are doing the same thing in the natural world. And so getting these conversations started is really important. Personally, as somebody who was trained in women's history, I've spent much of my career uncovering the lives of females in the human species, and something very similar is happening here in terms of biology. Also, in thinking about the kind of input of humanists and feminist scholars from Judith Butler on have challenged the gender binary, uncovering powerful stories of resistance, transformation, and resilience among trans, non-binary, and LGBTQ individuals. So I hope that today's talk and the talks to come inspire conversations across humanist, social science, and STEM scholars. And I should say, as an amateur bird watcher, like many people during COVID, it was a hobby I picked up. And also as a member of the Feminist Bird Club here at Buffalo, I suspect that humans have a lot to learn from birds. So with that, let me introduce today's speaker. Dr. Sara Lipshutz is an assistant professor in biology at Duke University. Her research group focuses on the evolution of behavior across weird and wonderfully diverse species of birds. This work bridges Muddy Boots' experimental fieldwork with a variety of molecular and computational approaches in genetics, genomics, neuroscience, and endocrinology. And her talk today is Multivariate Models of Animal Sex, Breaking Binaries in Biology. Please join me in welcoming Sara.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks so much, Victoria, for the introduction, and Megan for organizing, and also just to all of you for being here today. I actually want to also say that I owe a lot of work that I'm going to talk about today to a symposium that was led by Dr. Kelsey Lewis and Sam Sharp on sex, diversity, and variation at the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology a few years ago. And this is my first time speaking with an academic audience that's not strictly in biology, so that's very exciting to me. And I want to say that if there's a term or a concept or a figure that I'm using that you want more context about, if you'd like me to define it or explain it, just like raise your hand. I'm super happy to go into that. All right. So let's start out with this video. So this is a jacana, It's a tropical shorebird that I've been studying for over 10 years. And what's fascinating about this parenting behavior that we're seeing here, this chick brooding, where there's just a lot of little chick legs coming out from under the wings, that's a behavior that's only found in adult male jacanas. And this behavioral example can contradict the sort of traditional Darwinian sex roles of female parental care and male competition. But, historically, these birds have been called sex role reversed. And in fact, the majority of birds have both male and female parental care. Both sexes provision or feed the chicks in 90% of bird species. And beyond birds, many examples in fish, in frogs, and even mammals contradict this notion of traditional sex roles. So I identify most strongly as a behavioral ecologist. I want to know how evolutionary processes of natural and sexual selection shape behavioral variation. And then I get really mechanistic in trying to understand how genetic and hormonal and neural mechanisms contribute to this behavioral diversity. So more broadly, the work in my lab focuses on behaviors that are related to sexual selection in the social environment because they have consequences for the fitness outcomes of these organisms, whether they survive and reproduce. But we can also link these underlying mechanisms like physiology, genetics, neuroscience with the ecological and evolutionary outcomes for species interactions. So for today's talk, I want to first introduce a framework for understanding what I see as the complexity of biological sex in non-human animals. And then I'll focus on sex variation and diversity in this bird species, the jacana. And in this species, individuals vary in these reproductive behaviors like parental care as well as competition. And I'll talk about some of what we think are the neuroendocrine mechanisms that explain variation in these behaviors. So for the first part of this talk, I'll start with what I view as a problem. Many scientists who study the natural world, including biologists like me, are really into categories. So we want to fit everything into neat classifications and rules. This is sort of like the history of how science has been done for a long time. And this can be really useful for understanding the natural world in this sort of like simplistic or essentialist framing. But it's also a heavily flawed endeavor because the natural world doesn't really recognize categories. That's something that we scientists impose. And so when I was a PhD student, I confronted this problem. My PhD was on hybridization and speciation. There are over 20 definitions for what a species is. Debates among speciation biologists can get surprisingly contentious. I went through the review process on a hybrid zone between two bird species, and one of the reviewers were like, well, are they species or are they not? And the whole point was that they interbreed and they cross those boundaries. So I got, I guess, comfortable with the gray area. And I think that early work has shaped some of the ways that I view sex today. So when some part of animal diversity conflicts with these categorical expectations, we can respond in a couple different ways. We can view this as an aberration, an exception to the rule, and ignore it or discount it. Or we can just expand our framework to include this diversity and variation. So today I'm going to present this framework for expanding our definition of sex in biology. And propose some ways that my work measures and analyzes this expanded view. And I'll say that there's a lot more work to be done. Okay, so as the biologist with the microphone, I'm gonna, ask what is biological sex? A lot of scientists, this is also controversial. Within and especially outside of scientists. But I would say that there aren't too many biologists that are really challenging this view of what biological sex means, even though it gets used in a context far outside of biology. So as with our many species concepts, biologists have many definitions of sex. First, sex can be a process, how animals reproduce, but it's also a category. And sex is often viewed in this binary model. Individuals are classified as either male or female. And scientifically, we often represent the binary model with basically a bar plot or a box plot of like those two categories. So when we see sex as a biological variable, it's often sex as a binary variable. So this binary view is supported by the cellular mechanisms of reproduction. So this is when multiple, usually two parental gametes, we've got sperm and ova, combine genotypes to create an offspring. In animals, these gametes are of different sizes, usually a large ova and many small sperm. So many biologists, including, I teach introbiology, so this is like kind of the classic framework that we use. Many biologists take these two gamete types and they assign individual animals into male and female categories based on what gametes they have. Oftentimes, though, in the field as biologists, we have no idea. We're not looking at the animal's gametes, right? So this is an inference, but I'd like to present the case that defining sex by gametes alone, when we even do know what gametes these individuals are producing, and relying on a strict binary categorization of sex flattens the trait variation that occurs naturally and fails to accurately capture sex diversity. So perhaps a more inclusive definition of sex could be bimodal. So we have most individuals falling within one of two peaks of a trait distribution. So if we follow the bimodal model, in biology, comparisons between those two sometimes overlapping sex categories can be framed as sexual dimorphism. So this is, for instance, looking at morphological traits. If you think about height, you might have a distribution of height in male and female animals or even people where you have averages that are distinct, but there's some overlap. And it's really interesting to think about how big are the differences versus how much overlap there is, because actually most trait variation looks like this, where there's a ton of overlap, even though we might conceptually think that it looks like the one on the left. And so I think biologists are often looking more for differences than we are for similarities. And this really amazing paper came out last year by Kaya Tombak and colleagues. And this examined sexual dimorphism in body size across mammals. So in this rainbow figure here, we see an evolutionary tree on the left of the major mammal groups. That's on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, we see in the middle is 0. And you can see a dotted line coming up from 0. And at this dotted line, there's no difference in body size between female and male mammals. And each dot represents a species, and each row represents a mammalian family. So we see like rodents, rabbits, primates, etc. And what the take home of this figure is that most mammalian groups overlap with 0. So in other words, contrary to popular belief, only 45% or less than half of the 400 species they measured had male biased sexual dimorphism, or males that were bigger than females. So males are not larger than females in most mammal species. And this suggests that we might need to revisit our assumptions on sex differences in body size in mammals, even though that's like a classic example of sexual dimorphism, especially, the way we teach it at the undergraduate level. Like I have a lecture where I talk about elephant seals. Look what elephant seals are on this figure. They're like such an extreme, and extremes are really cool. Like I think extremes can be really great ways to teach material, but that's not the norm. And we're not teaching our students that is an exception. We're kind of teaching it like a rule. So if we want to understand, for instance, drivers of variation in body size, first we need to do the characterization work. But I think the framing is so important here. So I would argue that a bimodal model can work, but it's still an oversimplification. Since sex comprises multiple traits, already we've talked about gametes, but now we've added body size. There are variable distributions of these traits. And so I think all of these models can be valid, but we really should be talking about the traits themselves and then thinking about how they interact together. So we can analyze sex as a binary, as bimodal, or as multivariate. And that's just a term that my co-authors and I, Jess McLaughlin and Kinsey Brock, just sort of pulled from statistics. We're like, what is the word for a lot of things with different distributions? And so in this, I think this model is more expansive and inclusive, even though it's sort of like the everything model, because in this framework, individuals can possess many different combinations of traits that we think of as related to sex: chromosomes, anatomy, hormones, gametes. And these traits don't always align in binary ways. There are multiple trait values, and each of them can have different distributions. Yeah. So I guess I was going to talk about maybe some work that was published at the same time as this work, which said the complete opposite. So I'm happy to go into that later. But for now, let's talk about this model. So we might hear about chromosomal sex, and this varies widely across animals. What we might be most familiar with in humans are XX, XY mechanisms of so-called sex determination. And then in birds, which is the focus of my research, well, maybe I can, I don't know if I can scooch. Oh yeah, so I'll just scooch that over for a second. We see royal flycatchers. And on the left is a ZZ individual. In birds, males have ZZ chromosomes and females are ZW. So the heterogametic sex is the one with two different chromosomes. So that's XY in mammals, which are the categorization of males, but it's ZW or females in birds. And butterflies are like that too. So those are sort of still pretty kind of binary classifications of chromosomes and sex determination. There's a lot of variation within that. But there's also haplodiploid sex determination in ants and other social insects, where there's one or two copies of the genome that determines sex. In some cases, there's a mutation on the X chromosome that overrides the presence of a Y chromosome, like in these mice. Sex can also be totally independent of genetics and just rely on temperature. And that's what we see in these lizards and in turtles and in crocodiles. So there's not a universal framework of genetic sex, and it's not always binary. I should also give credit to Jess McLaughlin for all these gorgeous figures. So I would argue that sex is not binary, it's multivariate. Multivariate sex encompasses a broad constellation of sexual traits beyond gametes. Although there are many scientists who will still tell you that we have to define sex by gametes alone, and there's only two types. And then they'll acknowledge that there's a diversity of traits that sometimes or sometimes not align with those gametes. But I still think it's a very different framing to acknowledge this conceptual definition, because I think it shapes a lot of what comes after for how we study these traits. So you can name a lot of different traits that relate to sex. We use gametes as the example. We can look at gonads, anatomy, behavior, genetics, hormones, brains, etc. So for the next part of this talk, I'm going to give you examples of a multivariate model of sex from my research on birds focused on jacanas. And I'm going to focus on species with variation in reproductive behaviors like competition and parental care, and how neuroendocrine mechanisms might explain these behaviors. So I'm going to talk about the jacanas. We saw that video of a male doing the chick brooding behavior. So these are tropical shorebirds with a really cool mating system known as social polyandry. It's also considered resource defense polyandry. And it's formerly known as sex role reversal, although Malin King and Ingrid Inesio have a really excellent paper on the sex role concept. And so once I read that, it took me a couple of years to really digest it and think about how it affected my work, but I decided to no longer use the term sex role reversal. And we can chat more about that if you're interested. So social polyandry is characterized by a couple of things. It's found in only 1% of bird species. Females compete for mates. Sexual selection is stronger in females than in males. Females have multiple mates, so they're pair bonded, And that can be sequential. So they take turns with one male, lay some eggs, move on to the next male, or they can have multiple males at the same time. And in jacanas, that's what they do. They have a simultaneous polyandry system. And then there's also male-biased parental care, where males conduct most or all of the incubation and the chick rearing. There's also a strong pattern of sexual dimorphism in these species. So females are larger than males. They have more exaggerated ornamentation and weaponry. But what's really interesting is like when people look at these birds, it can be sometimes hard to tell, unless they're like actively copulating, which one is male and which one is female, because their plumage coloration is really similar. And so it's often body size that we use to tell them apart, but there's a lot of overlap. And so like in the published literature, when I was studying jacanas, I was trying to sex them by morphology alone, and I was getting all these intermediate morphology in body mass size. So what I ended up having to do was take a blood sample and look at their genetics. And so even, the foundational work in these species was doing the bimodal thing and then calling it binary, but not thinking about the overlap. Because development, right? Like these birds, as they get older, they get bigger. Okay, so I think these socially polyandrous systems are really valuable for testing predictions that are derived from males in traditional polygynous or socially monogamous mating systems, because they're an exception. And I think exceptions are really interesting for asking how sexual selection works in general. But I also think we can learn new things and then apply those things to all of the other systems as well. So I focus on jacanas in the family Jacanidae. They're one of the most well-known examples of social polyandry. 7 out of 8 of these species have this mating system. Today I'm going to be talking about work in the northern jacana. So they are year-round residents in Mexico and Central America, though they're nomadic with water. And so there's like in the tropics, there's a rainy season and a dry season, and they tend to reproduce more in the rainy season, although they live in agricultural systems where there's fresh water year round, so they can actually just like be reproductive for much longer than the rainy season. And they also live in freshwater marshes that may have more or less fresh water depending on the season. So in northern jacanas, both sexes aggressively compete for territories, but females face more intense sexual selection. So they defend these large territories, which encompass the smaller territories of multiple males. And that's that resource defense polyandry. So reproduction, at least as far as we know, is tied to being able to maintain and defend a territory. And then the males that have smaller territories, they have nests that the female lays eggs in and the males incubate them. So the males are also competing for the bounds of their territories. And it's funny, I think the males get a little bit ignored in this system. So but all individuals that have territories are competing for access to those territories as sites of reproduction. There's also a ton of floaters in this system. And so what that means is birds that they don't seem to have a territory, and as far as we know, they don't reproduce. And floaters in general in birds and other species are like really underexplored. So we often are focusing like only on the reproductive individuals and only the territory holders, and then sort of speaking for the whole species about what that means. But there's like a secret life of floaters that I'm really interested in exploring in the future. But so focusing on those territorial individuals, how do these sex differences in competition and parental care come about? And in other words, to use this provocative quote by G.C. Williams, an evolutionary biologist in 1975, why are males masculine and females feminine and occasionally vice versa? So we could like unpack this quote for hours, but I'm really interested in the vice versa here. We have these males doing the expected feminine role of parenting, and the females doing this masculine role of competing. So how does that come about? And so I go to proximate mechanisms, basically like what's under the hood of these organisms that are shaping these behaviors, the competitive or the caring phenotypes. And when we think about molecular mechanisms associated with competition, we go to testosterone. Testosterone has this known role in ornamentation, in weaponry, and aggressive behavior, classically in male animals. And so, there's more and more work now on its role in female animals, but maybe female jacanas have higher testosterone than males, and that could explain their competitive dominance. So I thought maybe testosterone would co-vary with mating traits in this species. Now, in jacanas, females are egg-laying machines. They produce a really small egg for how big their body is, and they can make lots and lots of eggs. And it's thought that that evolved because of the high predation rates. They lay their eggs on the ground and actually on floating vegetation on top of water. So there's a very high predation rate or nest failure rate. And so females are just constantly able to like replenish. Yeah, it's cool to think about mothering in this way. They're like, here's an egg, go take care of it. But males have these two reproductive stages. So they can be either courting females and seeking copulations, or they could be providing care in the form of incubation, where they're just like, they have sort of like the brood patches in their armpits, and they just kind of pull the eggs underneath to keep them warm, but they're also shading them when it's too hot. And then when the chicks hatch, they're kind of like walking around showing them where to eat, because these birds don't actually feed their young. They just kind of like show them how to feed. The chicks basically hatch and they could walk already. So males are cycling in between these two stages, which I had never thought about male cycling before thinking about this system. Initially, when I was working on these birds, I was like, I'm going to study males and I'm going to study females. And then I was like, oh, these reproductive males are doing two very different things. So I kind of had to partition that data a little bit further. So I thought that parenting males, given what we know about testosterone's role in interfering with parental care, that parenting males might have lower testosterone than males that were seeking courtship. And I wasn't really sure how females would compare to males in those two stages. And then, yeah, is testosterone also associated with competitive traits like ornamentation, weaponry, aggression? And then finally, testosterone is just a hormone signal. And so through this work, I also came to appreciate that the power of a signal is only relative to the system that receives it, binds it, transports it, converts it to other hormones that are more active in the tissue in a tissue-specific way. So I also looked at gene expression in the brain in these same individuals. And we know that within a species, the sexes share really similar genomes, like most of their genome is the same. But we see different morphological, behavioral, and physiological differences between the sexes. And so I was really interested in using this thing called transcriptomics, or just the expression of a gene as an intermediary to the phenotype. When and how much of these genes are expressed can help explain the variation that links genotype to phenotype. So to collect this data, I worked with some awesome students in the field in Panama, Evan Buck and Clara Howell, and we measured a suite of traits that are important in mating success in jacanas from the literature. So this includes body mass. We know that females that have larger bodies are more likely to hold territories and reproduce relative to those floater individuals. They're smaller. They also have wing spurs. This is like a crazy weapon that they have. It would be like on their wrist here, but it sort of looks like it's on their shoulder. And that it seems like it's a weapon that's important in signaling, but also fighting. And we also looked at the facial ornament, which is this fleshy trait, as well as territorial aggression. So here's how I measured territorial aggression. So I'm simulating a territorial intrusion with this decoy and a Bluetooth speaker playing conspecific or same species vocalizations. And then I put it on the territory of a focal female individual, and I'm hiding behind this like camouflage blind. And at first I thought I would just stay there and like watch what happens, but it turns out the birds don't care unless this thing is moving. So I had to figure out how to like attach strings and rotate it, and that seemed to capture their attention. And so I measured aggressive responses from the territory holders, including distance to this decoy, like how close they get, how many times they vocalize against it, how many times they flew over it, spread their wings, this like in this aggressive posture, and physically attacked. Okay, and then from plasma in the blood, with the help of Elizabeth George, I measured the testosterone in circulation using an enzyme amino acid assay, basically just how much testosterone is there in the blood of each individual. So here's what I found. Across these three groups, I found that females had circulating levels of testosterone on par with parenting males, and they were pretty low. And then courting males had much higher testosterone, although there's a lot of variation and not a huge sample size. I initially went into this study saying I'm going to look at 12 males and 12 females, and then quickly realized that the males were in those two different groups. So small sample size, but that's pretty typical for these sorts of studies anyhow. So this did not support my hypothesis that females are more competitive because they have higher testosterone in circulation. But it does show that sex differences in testosterone levels vary with breeding stage, right? So it matters whether males are carrying or courting. And this pattern wasn't unique to jacanas. So I conducted a meta-analysis of testosterone studies across all socially polyandrous birds that had data. And I found a really similar pattern to what I found in jacanas. So we're looking at that dotted line around 0 again here. And what we can see in the top for males that were in a courtship phase, if you're to the left of this dotted line, testosterone is higher in males than in females. And so for males in that courting stage, we see that all males had higher testosterone than females. But when males were in a parenting stage, which is what's in the bottom half, we see no difference between the sexes. So the sex difference disappears during the parenting phase as testosterone levels drop in males. So this was a summary of sort of sex differences and similarities. We always are talking about the differences between sexes, and testosterone is one of those key molecules that we talk about, that key hormone. But it's so context dependent, and we're not really careful when we talk about the breeding stage of the males themselves. So yeah, you could say that there's a sex difference, but it depends on what stage you're looking at. So this summarizes sort of these categorical groupings of sex and testosterone, but I also looked at the continuous variation in testosterone and competitive traits. And one of the key relationships I found was with that weapon, the wing spur. So at the individual level, I found that testosterone levels in females only correlated with the weapon size. So females that had higher levels of testosterone had longer wing spurs. And that suggests that testosterone plays some role in this female competitive trait. I did not find this relationship in males. In males, I did see that testosterone correlated with testes size. So testes were larger in the courting males that were seeking those copulations, and then the testes were smaller in those parenting males. And that really is what got me thinking about this cycling, right? These gonads are getting bigger and smaller in males, depending on what breeding stage they're in, when spermatogenesis becomes really important in courtship. And that's a known thing that testosterone can do, is affect the testes size. So there's this cycling between male breeding stages that is likely promoted by testosterone. So an important take home here is that testosterone is not only a male hormone. We might hear more about testosterone's role in males, and typically males have higher testosterone levels in circulation than females when they're in that courtship stage, which is just a brief part of their life cycle. But females have the same molecular machinery to produce and to respond to testosterone. So in my research on jacanas, I found that testosterone levels depend not only on that binary framing of gametic sex, like do you have sperm or ova, but are also influenced by the breeding stage, or the ecology, the seasonal ecology. When they're parenting, males have similarly low levels of testosterone to females. And also testosterone is mediating a weapon that's important in female competition. And we didn't find that relationship in males. So testosterone is just one signal. The salience of that signal, its effectiveness, matters in the context of how the system receives it. So you can't just like circulate a hormone in your body without a system that can respond to that hormone. And that often happens in a tissue-specific way. So when we're thinking about behavior in particular, we looked to the brain. And one mechanism I was really interested in was tissue sensitivity to hormones. So we looked at the brains of these same individuals, the females that were competing, males that were parenting, and males that were courting. And here I worked with an amazing team of undergrads and master's students. We conducted what's called RNA sequencing on these microdissected brains. So in order to do this, there was a lot of complicated fieldwork involved, but then there was actually no brain atlas for jacanas. So we had to use the chicken atlas and then really carefully microdissect and stain the brain in these different cryosections. It's sort of like a fancy deli slicer. I realize you guys are eating lunch. That always happens. So, but figuring out like where these brain regions of interest were. And we focused on what's known as the social behavior network, because that's a network of brain regions that are highly conserved or similar across lots of species, have been well studied, and are regions of the brain that are known to influence social and reproductive behaviors. So we focused on the nucleus taniae, which is the bird homologue of the medial amygdala in humans, and the preoptic area of the hypothalamus. Both of these regions have been implicated in the regulation of both aggression and parental care. So we thought these were good places to look. And we're using transcriptomics, or the expression of genes in the brain here, to understand sex-specific expression. So females and males share the vast majority of their genome, but differences in the transcriptome, or which genes are turned on or off at a particular time, can help maybe us understand differences in their behaviors. So the first thing we did with our gene expression data was just throw it into a principal components analysis. And so this is an analysis that partitions variance in the data without us categorizing it. Right, so this is just like, how are all of these genes related? And then we color them by individual, by breeding stage, and by brain region. So the colors are in position, but the variation here is just how the data are related to each other by this model. And so I'll orient you here. The brain regions are the preoptic area of the hypothalamus is the circle, and the nucleus taniae is a triangle. So just circles and triangles are different brain regions. And then the groups, females are in red, and just to be gender normative here, right? And males are in blue. The light blue are the courting males, and the dark blue are the parenting. So if we look at the x-axis here below, the first thing we see is that 85% of variance, so the majority of variation in this data set, is partitioned across brain region. So from the left is the preoptic area of the hypothalamus. That's where you see all the circles on the left going up and down, and the nucleus taniae, all the triangles on the right. So what that's telling us is that most of the variation in gene expression is explained by brain region first. So different regions of the brain express different genes. On the y-axis, we see only 7% of the variance is separating the sexes. So a much smaller proportion, where we see the blues on top and the reds on the bottom. And then when we look at the breeding stage, we actually didn't really see partitioning between those two breeding stages in males, the courting and the parenting stages. So I think a really interesting take home here, and not one that I was expecting, is that brain region is more important in explaining gene expression than sex. We often hear about male brains or female brains, or masculinized and feminized brains. But in jacanas, the brain region specific differences explain more of the variation than gene expression in between the sexes. So the next thing we looked at were genes that differed between females and males. So now we're actively saying, I have these two categories and I want to compare how they're different. And we did this for females versus courting males, females versus parenting males, and parenting males versus courting males. So it's just a bunch of t-tests, basically. And this is what we call differential gene expression. So this is what it looks like. It's just a bunch of bar plots. On the top are genes that are higher in females and lower in males. And on the bottom are genes that are higher in males and lower in females. And we did this for those comparisons, females to courting, females to parenting, within the males, parenting to courting, for each brain region. So the main takeaway here, so in red, those genes are more highly expressed in females. And then in blue are the genes that are more highly expressed in males of either of the breeding groups. And there's hundreds of genes that differ between the sexes. But most of them are higher in males than they are higher in females. And that's something that's actually like kind of common in birds. And initially we were scratching our heads like, why would that be? I think a priori we would just expect that like the same numbers of genes differ in one direction or the other in females or males. If we just look within the males, we see that there are very few genes that differ. So why is it that these differentially expressed genes tend to be more highly expressed in males? Like, why are these bars just lower here? That's showing that the bias of gene expression data is towards males. And the answer is the genome. So I mentioned earlier that birds have this heterogametic sex. This should say homogametic sex, actually. Males are homogametic, so they have two Z's, and females are heterogametic. They have a Z and a W. Birds also have something called incomplete dosage compensation, which is just that when there are genes on a chromosome and you have two of those chromosomes, so like if you're a male with two Z's, both sets of genes on your Z's get expressed. In other words, you get double the gene expression than females because they only have one Z. And so this pattern, you might interpret it and say, oh, people often use this pattern of male bias gene expression. They say, it's because sexual selection is stronger on males. They're just like more happening with their genes. And it's like, well, that can't be true in this system because in this system, sexual selection is stronger on females. So if you actually like just look at the mechanism, it's because of the genetic architecture. It's just because males have two Z's. So there could be really interesting functional implications of having two Z's for like which genes are more highly expressed in which sex. But I think it's really important to understand the biological basis of that before we go off interpreting and saying it's because of sexual selection. It's really just because of genetic architecture here. And so, yeah, we looked at what the identity of those genes were, and over half of those genes that were higher in males just were on the Z chromosome. So it was just the genetic architecture explaining that. So the next thing that we did was, given what we know already about the role of certain genes in influencing behavior, we sort of took a candidate approach, and we looked through our data set and we asked which of those genes that we already know have a known role in aggression or parental care are showing up in our data set, and how do they differ between these three groups of females, parenting males, and courting males. And one of the first genes that we looked at was the androgen receptor. So testosterone is an androgen, it's not the only one, but the receptor is what binds testosterone so that it can act on the body in a tissue-specific way. And actually, androgen receptor is what we call a transcription factor. So when testosterone binds to the androgen receptor, it can go and influence the expression of other genes. So this is how testosterone does stuff in the body. And what we see here is that females in the preoptic area of the hypothalamus had higher expression of androgen receptor than males in those other groups. We didn't really see a relationship in the nucleus teniae, but in the preoptic area of the hypothalamus, androgen receptor expression was lowest in parenting males. That's shown here in dark blue, and a little bit higher in the courting males, but even higher on average in the females. Although you'll see there's actually a lot of individual variation, and so I think it's important to show your dots and not just bars. So what this suggests is that parenting males are shutting down their sensitivity to testosterone when they're parenting. So we already saw that they had lower testosterone in circulation. They're shutting down their production of testosterone. They're also shutting down their sensitivity to testosterone. And in contrast, even though females had low levels of testosterone, they have high levels of sensitivity to testosterone. So that might be a potential way that they're responsive to testosterone, but at low levels, by increasing the sensitivity with the expression of the androgen receptor. This result, it actually supports a previous study of other socially polyandrous species, including barred button quails on the left and black kukels. And they similarly found higher expression of androgen receptor or sensitivity to testosterone in the brains of females relative to males. So I think a take home here is it's important to not only consider the hormone signal, but also the mechanisms that receive that signal and their tissue-specific patterns. And it seems that maybe a common trait or common pattern is that socially polyandrous females rely on higher sensitivity to testosterone while keeping the testosterone levels themselves low as they circulate in the body. Another gene that we looked at was the prolactin receptor. So this, here we see that it's highest in parenting males, and then next highest in courting males, and lowest in females in the proleptic area of the hypothalamus, and a similar pattern of higher in males and lower in females in the nucleus teniae. So prolactin hormone in birds binds to this prolactin receptor and regulates parental behaviors like incubation. So it makes sense that males that are doing the incubating have the highest sensitivity to prolactin. Or I guess we should just say these are gene expression patterns. We didn't like do protein chemistry here. So prolactin hormone is also really important in parental care across vertebrates. You may have heard of it in relation to the release of milk in lactation. So it's important in mammals too, but in birds, like incubation is what they do instead of lactation. Oh, well, pigeons have a really cool lactation with their crop milk that's also regulated by prolactin, but that's really different. So we see kind of a similar story to androgens, except it's now in males that have this higher sensitivity to this hormone that's important in parenting. So to sum up here, what might regulate the traits of competitive females and caring males? Females don't have higher testosterone in circulation, but testosterone in males does decrease with parental care. Testosterone is associated with a competitive trait, the wing spur, in females, and with a testes size in males. When we look at gene expression in the brain, we found some interesting sex and breeding stage specific patterns, especially for hormone sensitivity, which is potentially related, right, to the sensitivity to androgens in females and to prolactin in males. So a take home there is also that prolactin is not only a female hormone, it's really a parenting hormone. I think when we see those big differences in gene expression with those bar plots, it's really just genetic architecture that explains that. Just the way that males have two Z's and females have a Z and a W. So we really should be careful about over-interpreting like what more genes really means functionally. So this is what I see as an expanded conceptual framework of biological sex, using this multivariate model to explore at lots of different levels, the genetics, the hormones, the brains, the ornamentation and weaponry, the behavior, the gonads, all of these things that together comprise our understanding of sex. And this is what I think has encouraged me to think about sex variation rather than sex differences, because I think we learn the most when we see the continuous variation among individuals, more than when we split things into binary categories. I think both are useful, but if we only stuck with our binary categories, we might not have learned as much about the biology of these organisms. So I really think we can view these traits as a continuum. And I think this really relates to one of my favorite quotes. This is from Joan Roughgarden in her book, Evolution's Rainbow. The biggest error in biology today is uncritically assuming that gamete size binary implies a corresponding binary in body type, behavior, and life history. So the existence of those two gamete types doesn't always predict what we see as this multivariate diversity of sexual traits. So why does it matter which model of biological sex we use? So as a scientist, I'm really influenced by my preconceived notions of a binary in biology. This is what I learned in my undergraduate and graduate training. This is what like society tells me the world is. So binary thinking about sex shapes the questions we ask, the way we understand organismal diversity in our research, and we often anthropomorphize and impose our cultural binary onto other organisms, but it can really hinder the way that we understand their diversity. And this matters because, like, yeah, we all want to do better science, but also as biologists, many of us are educators. And so we need to be really careful with how we describe this complexity in our classrooms. For instance, if we're going to emphasize the extreme size dimorphism in elephant seals, maybe we should also talk about what's the norm, which is no difference in size in mammals. And really risk, we need to be careful about perpetuating misconceptions that can obscure the actual mechanisms that we're trying to teach. Outside of the classroom, this also really matters for discriminatory policies that enact real harm on trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. And I think this is where it's important to be clear about my positionality, because like I'm supposed to be this objective scientist, right? But I live in this world where it's actually definitions of biological sex are being used to deny the rights of trans and gender non-conforming people. Biologists themselves lack specificity in what biological sex even is, but then we often are hiding away from the real political and cultural implications for human rights. So I usually give seminars to biology departments where this is sort of more of like, I never thought about that. I'm sure all of you would think about this all the time. I hope to just have given you the perspective of a biologist that sex isn't as binary as it's claimed to be. And so I'm really excited to hear your thoughts. I want to acknowledge so many mentors and collaborators and funding sources. And then 2 papers that have recently come out, and the co-authors on those papers on sex diversity and variation that have been really fun and helped me sort of conceptualize my thinking more clearly. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. I'm going to actually do a sort of Oprah thing here to make sure that people online can actually hear the questions. So I'm going to pass around a microphone. But I might just take my prerogative to ask the first question as a historian, and I'm sort of interested in history of science in the context of this talk. If you could just talk a little bit about how new this research is, how it's been received, and just to give me because we have that quote from the 70s, right?
Yeah.
So what happened between the 70s and 2024 in terms of kind of history of science?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, I would say that I'm like new to this field, so I'll give you like what is my own understanding, but I think there's a much richer answer that you might be able to give me. So I'd be interested in hearing from you too, but I'll just share. So like Joan Roughgarden, when her book Evolution's Rainbow came out, which was I think 2005, was like she was sort of like not well received from, before she transitioned, she was like thought of as a hardcore biologist who does empirical work. But with this book, I think people were really dismissive. And she was challenging like a lot of paradigms, which is a super risky and scary thing to do. Today, a lot of scientists agree with what she was saying. I mean, they also disagree with other things, which is cool and normal, but I think she was like a pariah of her time. And I've also been thinking a lot about, like who does the work, because if we go all the way back to Darwin, like this Victorian idea or the Darwinian sex roles, like it's males competing and females carrying, and like he was even afraid to share broadly that he thought females might actually have agency and were choosing males. I think he knew that, but it was like maybe like a more controversial thing in society at the time. So I think it's also mattered the demographic of who's doing the science. And we have just been in a really like white, cis het male field in evolutionary biology. Interestingly, neuroendocrinology and behavior have had a lot more women scientists doing this work. And so for them, they're like, obviously behavior is like flexible and hormones change. But I think the evolution or the genetics fields maybe were more conservative. I think a really big change has been the inclusion of trans, intersex, and non-binary scientists. And so I think that's maybe the decade that we're living in now, is like those scientists are becoming faculty, getting stable positions, like being able to share their perspective and their scholarship to challenge a lot of these paradigms.
Great, that's incredibly informative. Thank you so much. So I'm going to open it up. People have questions, comments?
Thank you so much for your talk. The disclaimer for this question is that I'm asking as somebody who's more familiar with the history and philosophy of the social sciences, not the natural sciences. But it does seem that because so much is collected, so many traits is collected under the category of sex, that it's inevitably going to be a troubled category. And so it seems like what you're presenting here is a way, it seems, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is a way of maintaining the category of sex in its diversity, or its multivariationness, and adjudicating causal relationships within that category. But also like a different one, and this is a common discussion, the social sciences is defining the concept quite narrowly, and then adjudicating causal relationships outside of the concept itself. So I was wondering if you could speak about the value of maintaining this umbrella category of sex and talking about like the ruptures and instabilities that continuously emerge within it because of how the category is defined, rather than saying like, we're going to narrowly define it as gamete type, and then we look outside, this is a relationship to body type, which is not categorized under the head of sex.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually, so the paper I was alluding to is by Wolfgang Goiman. I think there were one or two more co-authors, and it was something like biological sex is binary, even though there's a rainbow of other traits. And I actually like don't really disagree with that framing either. I think both are valid framings, but I think it's a little bit wishful thinking because we're already like messy in the way that we use sex. And so I think the multivariate framework is more just acknowledging that we use sex interchangeably with all of those different axes of variation. And so it's sort of like the cat's out of the bag. Like it would be really great if we just didn't have a binary as a foundation, but we do. And so rather than just like come up with new terms, I think this is just sort of embracing the messiness of it, but I don't disagree with the other framing. Yeah, I think if you ask like which one of us gets more fan mail from TERFs, it's Goiman. And so I think there's also a responsibility to not have a sex essentialist view because it's so easily co-opted by bad actors. But I think conceptually both are valid.
More questions?
My question is a biology one. Do the floaters float because they can't form a territory, or are they just not forming a territory? Or are they choosing to not form a territory?
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Like, could it just be a strategy? So like, we don't really know what makes an individual a floater or a territory holder. That is also sort of a binary framing. It could be something that happens developmentally of just like when you're smaller and you're younger, like you don't have as much resource holding potential. But that's something that could change over your lifetime. Or it could be like a polymorphism that exists that is genetically or hormonally influenced, or shaped by the current environmental situation, like territorial availability at all. And it's possible that you could just like dump some eggs when no one's looking. So I'm really interested in actually like following individuals across their lifetimes. And I think that's going to be the focus of my next grant, because so much of my work really here is like putting individuals into these categories and just saying like females do this and males do this. And like, oh yeah, and males have these two groups. But I really want to know within females, like how variation in these hormonal and morphological phenotypes shape their reproductive success. So that's kind of, the floaters are sort of my next question.
So a related question, do the floaters sneak mates?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. So there's these like behavioral polymorphisms where there's like a satellite and a sneaker and a territory holder that we see in fish and other birds. And it's totally possible, but we have no idea in jacanas. Yeah.
Questions from the room? We have a couple online questions too. Let's take some more.
So that begs the question, are floaters always female?
There are floater males too. There's actually like a huge difference in sex ratio in the populations I've studied, where there's always like way more males than there are females. But it could be, I think we have to actually ask like everyone in the population and then the territory holders versus the non-territory holders, because that could be where, like, if you're always laying 4 eggs, like what's happening?
Do floater males steal chicks?
Yeah, so you can imagine that a floater male is like copulating with the female, but then he sort of like doesn't have to do any parental care. Because that's sort of thought of as a burden. It's like, you know, a high reproductive cost. If you look at the genetic paternity on eggs that any given male is incubating, females can have up to 4 or 5 males. Sometimes they only have 1. So there's a lot of variation in the degree of polyandry. But when a female has like 4 males, the risk that those eggs that a male is incubating are not his own genetic contribution is like 74%. So it's also like, why are males doing this? Yeah. No one ever asked that question in females, right? It's just what they're supposed to be doing.
Great talk. I'm obsessing with the AR and prolactin receptor expression of the POA. This is just at one time. In the females, we're looking at one time, right?
Totally.
Like with the males, we have those like 2. Yeah, sounds like in the future you'll be looking at. I'm just wondering, like, do you think the AR expression of the POA is going to change if we're looking at a different, either at floater females or at like a different,
Or outside of breeding.
Outside of
Yeah,
breeding
because this was just a
season.
particular time window,
Yeah.
and gene expression changes so much. Hormones change so much also. I mean, it's shocking that I found like any relationship. Yeah.
Maybe it's like comparable
Yeah.
expression level, but now I'm just like, oh my gosh, what's happening the rest of the time?
Yeah.
Like, is that just, there's this time during breeding when AR is at this level?
That's a problem for like all of biology. There's this really, I would say like Western and like North American framing of like, I'm free in the summers. And so that's when I go study my birds because I teach classes the rest of the time. And so like, yeah, we are really biased towards reproductive biology at this particular window. So it takes longer term work. It takes understanding like all of the seasonal variation. And then like, you know, studying all the different tissues and all the different genes. But yeah, I think what I'd really like to do is follow floaters, look at gene expression, look at hormonal variation across these longer temporal windows, because it could be cyclical too. Yeah.
Great.
I was really interested by this social polyandry structure that is found in the behavior of these birds. So we know that there's the courting males and then there's the parental males. Do the parental males also have competition among which males actually get to take care of eggs and take care of chicks? And let's say in a particular mating season, a particular male does not get that opportunity where they make a nest and they do not get any eggs, and then do they switch roles at that point in time?
Yeah, so I think that like the floaters are important to consider there, but also just intermale variation within that mating group. We don't know at all. Like there's so many open questions. But you can imagine that a male might want to maximize the number of chances for fertilization of the gametes of the ova. And so there's this really cool paper in a different Jacana species that's called the yelling for sex. And males that yelled more got more copulations and sired more paternity. So I think there's this sexual conflict going on where the female just wants a bunch of males, right? She just wants like a bunch of babysitters. But the males probably don't want to get stuck with caring for eggs that aren't their own genetic contribution. And so it's interesting just to think about the ways that might play out. And we also don't know if females are paying attention to particular traits that males have that they might say, well, you're a good caregiver, but maybe I don't like the length of your wing spurs or something like that. So yeah, a lot more to be explored about the individual choices that females and males are making, and how like the stage that they're at affects how much they're investing and what their payoffs are.
Maybe we'll take an online question. Okay, I have a question about the relationship between hormones, expression and reception and behavior. Do the hormones determine the behavior, a causal relationship in one direction? Or is this relationship dynamic or mutually informing?
Oh, yeah, great question. It's totally both. Yeah, so it can be bidirectional. There was a really cool study actually that Becca Safran did, where she colored tree swallows like feathers, and it actually changed their hormone levels because of the inference here is that having a different signal that other individuals are seeing affects like your social status in the hierarchy. And that can feed back on how you're treated and how you behave, and your hormones are affected by your social environment. So these are really complex relationships, and it's definitely not only like an A to B of like this internal proximate thing like affects this behavior thing. There's a lot of feedback. And even testosterone, it regulates the androgen receptor. So levels of androgen receptor are influenced by levels of testosterone. So that's another feedback relationship. And then the androgen receptor can influence a lot of other genes in the genome. So it's very complex. I think what I presented here was like a pretty simplistic model. But yeah, they're all related and they all influence each other.
Right, I'm going to do another online question here. My question is more philosophical. Many times the resistance to change and readjust definitions from people in the sciences is related to show me the data. With data as compelling as this, where could the resistance be coming from?
Ooh. Thank you. I think I am of a generation and an identity where I don't personally face a lot of resistance. I can say that my mentor, Kim Roswell, and her mentor, Ellen Ketterson, we all do this like female birds hormones stuff. They faced a lot of resistance, for instance, when they would submit a paper saying that sexual selection even occurs in female animals, right? That like females are competing for mating opportunities, even if it's through choice or, you know, aggression. They received a ton of pushback, and like reviewers were just so gatekeeping that possibility. This was like a 2011 paper that Kim published in her dissertation, and there were all these like think pieces about it, and like you can't call it sexual selection. I didn't really have to fight those battles because of the groundwork that they laid. But I actually think that I might be fighting a different battle, which is not only about females in biology, but about anything outside of the gender binary, or what I consider the sex binary. And I think that the people who are receiving the most resistance are people who are trans and intersex and non-binary scientists, because their visibility makes them more vulnerable to those sorts of attacks. And as like a white cis woman, I don't face those attacks. So I think that like this work is important to do when you have, also I'm faculty now. Like I waited a long time to put these ideas out there till I had some degree of job stability. I had to like, you know, prove my empirical chops before I got into this work. So like I do population geneticist, I'm a neuroendocrinologist, but I care a lot about sex diversity too. And I think that work is not as appreciated or integrated into like our undergraduate curriculum as it should be. So I think the resistance is about people whose identities have been the default, both in who does science and the way that science has persisted for a really long time. I think that's changing. It's making people upset because they have to give up power. But I feel like super optimistic that this work is ongoing, and it really feels like a groundswell movement. If you just look at the number of publications coming out, the number of like last week I was on a symposia for female perspectives in birds, and it was so uplifting. It was mostly graduate students and postdocs like leading the symposium. Like it wasn't anymore about like, we just don't know how it happens, there's so many gaps. It was like, oh yeah, we've like studied this extensively, like here's how it works. So I'm feeling very optimistic. I think there will always be resistance, but I'm really focused on the communities that are like doing this work in such an uplifting way that it's kind of nice to just like not worry about the haters so much.
More questions from the room? Yeah.
So I guess you've mentioned a couple of times like the importance of teaching this in undergrad.
curriculum, so I'm curious how you approach that.
Yeah, I'm so lucky to be teaching a genetics and evolution class to 200 students. It's taught every semester, and I'm going in gently at first because I want to understand the history of the way the course has been taught, but I have already been allowed to totally revamp the sexual selection lecture. And so like Kaya Tombach's paper on sexual dimorphism, like the course had a video on elephant seals, and I was like, this is great, but that's an exception. Like, and so there's also this idea of diversity first, where we actually just present all of the diversity for whatever concept we're teaching. And before we say like, here's how it is, and then here's an exception, and then, oh, like it's overturning it, like that's very confusing for students, and they're probably just going to remember like the wrong thing. So I have gone to teacher trainings on like teaching sexual selection. And then I have a lot of freedom in how I teach that in the classroom. It's really cool. I think the sexual selection lecture, like students take out their phones and are like filming the videos. And yeah, I think it's, you know, I think they're ready for it. I think that also like the Animal Behavior Society did a poll for its membership, and like between 60 and 70% of the undergraduates in the Animal Behavior Society have a queer identity. And so there's just a lot of openness about like a changing landscape of identity in undergraduates that I know it's going to be discipline specific and regional in terms of how comfortable people are like sharing those identities, or those identities being welcomed by like state legislatures, for instance. But at least at like a private institution, I have a lot of freedom in what I get to present. Yeah.
How about one more online question? Here. Okay, great. How do you see your research being used in a social science capacity, if at all? We know that there are more than one biological sex, even in humans. However, there is a lot of harm being done to those who may fall outside of their constructed binary. We see a lot of this in discussions about athletes and the use of transphobic rhetoric in these arguments.
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of the recent kind of perspective pieces that I've written or seen other people writing have to do with experimental design. So when you are going to conduct an experiment or to collect data, to be really clear about naming the variables, and then having that be explicit in the study when you say, here were our criteria for categorizing sex, or here are these like multiple kinds of variables that we used. So, and then it can also not only an experimental design of data collection, but then also analysis. Are you going to, I think I have a, oh gosh, this thing like populates. Yeah. So historically, like the sex as a biological variable, that's like revolutionary to just even consider individuals who aren't male. But then there are so many other ways to do that outside of a binary. So this is at least for neuroendocrinology, but I think it can extend to really anyone that's analyzing data that's related to sex, is you can do so much more with how you group traits. Sorry, these figures are really small, but this is sort of like a how-to guide for how you might want to analyze your data. And there's so much more you can do than just binning it into binary variables. But yeah, I think like the simplest thing to do is being really explicit in how you're collecting your data and making that clear.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? Well, let's give Sarah a round of applause. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for attending. Feel free to pick up a poster on your way out and food if you did not get it before, and come for our next lecture next semester. Have a wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.